Now, something else that happened during this time period was the United States went through the first Red Scare. And, Reds, that's a term that we tend to use to refer to communists. And of course, during the course of World War I, Russia went through really a couple of revolutions. The March Revolution brought the Mensheviks to power. And the Mensheviks were kind of socialist, but they weren't, they were a little bit more moderate and so this fairly liberal government forced the Tsar to abdicate and took control of Russia. And then in November, a second revolution took place. And it was in the November Revolution that the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin came to power. And the Bolsheviks were communist. And once again, communists are those that really embraced the ideas of Karl Marx, who believed that the proletariat or working class of the world would rise up and take control of the means of production, and that with that they would, ultimately there would be no need for government because everything would kind of be shared and held in common. Now, of course, here in the United States, we believe in capitalism. We practice capitalism. So there was a real strong belief that we needed to hold on to and protect capitalism here in the United States, and so many Americans began to grow fearful of a wide variety of groups that we might consider radicals, and that would include Bolsheviks or communists, as well as other radicals, including anarchists. And part of this led to what became known as the Palmer Raids. A. Mitchell Palmer was the Attorney General at the time, and he kind of led a campaign against different radical groups. And what would happen is suspected radicals ran the risk of being deported. And so we really took a pretty tough line against radicals at this point in time. And it also fed into those anti-immigrant feelings that were so prevalent in the United States. And then, as I mentioned, we had a number of strikes that took place in the year 1919. Probably the most notorious of which was a general strike that took place in the city of Seattle, Washington. And, that strike left such scars that business stayed away from Seattle for quite some time afterward. And so, some of the reactions that we saw here in the United States, Americans responded in a wide variety of ways. One way that the Americans dealt with this anti-immigrant feeling was through restricting immigration. So, various limits were placed on immigration to try to restrict the immigrants that were received and to try to limit immigrants from certain countries. That was kind of one of those changes. For example, a 1921 law established a quota or a set number of immigrants to be allowed into the United States from various countries. Then the National Origins Act of 1924 set quotas for each country at 2% of the number of people from that country currently living in the United States, clearly to reduce immigration from certain countries. This act nearly eliminated immigration from Asian countries. And then another case that at kind of more towards the late 20s really began to have a very significant impact as it was really a reflection of the anti-immigrant feelings of the time, was the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. What happened is, in a nutshell, in this case, you had two Italian immigrants, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, who both happened to be anarchists. So, they were indeed immigrants, and they were indeed radicals, being that they held to a pretty, being an anarchist is a pretty radical political philosophy. But what ended up happening is they end up being charged with a couple of crimes in particular, and they ultimately end up both receiving the death penalty, particularly for a violent robbery. But whether or not they were guilty, it's hard to say. There's certainly plenty of evidence that would indicate that they may not have been guilty, and there's certainly some evidence that points to their guilt as well. But what really became apparent, and I think was shocking about this, is that it's very obvious that they did not receive a fair trial. What we know is that they largely were targeted because they were immigrants and because they were radicals, not so much because of the evidence against them. And so this is one of those cases that many people ended up being pretty upset after the execution was carried out because they felt that justice had not been served. And I think it's fair to say that it hadn't been.